My name's Emma, and I've always prided myself on being an independent woman. For as long as I can remember, I've worked hard to carve out a life that was all my own. I'm a journalist, and I've spent years building a successful career in the bustling, fast-paced world of New York City media. It's not for everyone, but it suits me perfectly. I thrive on deadlines, the challenge of digging deeper, and the satisfaction of telling stories that matter, stories that help people understand the world a little better. But despite the satisfaction I found in my work, I could never quite figure out how to make my personal life match the fulfillment I felt professionally. I've always been a bit of a loner at heart. After my divorce, I took a step back from relationships and focused on myself. I wasn't in any hurry to get back into something that might just fall apart like my last marriage. I didn't have time for a rebound. But then I met Ben. It wasn't love at first sight, but there was something about him, a kind of warmth and understanding that drew me in. Ben was everything I hadn't expected. He was calm, steady, and thoughtful. Unlike many of the people I'd dated before, he wasn't looking for validation or attention. He had his own life, his own sense of self, and I respected that. We connected slowly, at first through casual dinner dates and late-night conversations about our lives. He had been through a lot. His wife had passed away suddenly several years before we met, and in the years that followed, he had thrown himself into raising his son, Ethan, a 19-year-old at the time. Ben had always been the type to wear his heart on his sleeve, and his love for his son was evident in everything he did. It was clear that Ethan was the center of his world, and I admired that. When Ben and I started talking about the future, he never once pressured me to take on the role of mom in Ethan's life. He understood that blending families wasn't easy, and I think we both hoped things would fall into place as we spent more time together. But it wasn't going to be that simple, and I wasn't fully prepared for how challenging those first few months would be. Ethan was, to put it plainly, distant. It wasn't that he was rude or disrespectful. He wasn't openly hostile, and he didn't make it hard for me to be around him. But he kept to himself in a way that made it hard to connect with him. The walls he had up were clear. At 19, he was already an adult, but the grief of losing his mom hung heavily over him. I could see that, and I tried to give him the space he needed. Ben and I would have dinner together in the evenings, but more often than not, Ethan would retreat to his room or to the far side of the house, never really engaging with us. Sometimes I'd catch him sitting quietly at the kitchen table, absorbed in his photography work or a book, and I'd feel this knot in my stomach. I knew he wasn't interested in having any kind of relationship with me, and I didn't want to push it. I told myself it was fine. After all, he was still figuring things out. He had lost his mother, and I was a stranger who had suddenly become a part of his life. I had no idea what it must have felt like for him, so I didn't want to rush him. Ben would often reassure me that things would take time, that Ethan wasn't a child, and that he would come around when he was ready. But as the weeks turned into months, I couldn't help but feel like I was walking on eggshells in my own home. It wasn't the comfortable, welcoming family dynamic I'd hoped for, and I couldn't help but feel isolated. There were moments when I'd reach out, ask Ethan about his day, or about his college life, trying to show interest in his world. But his responses were always short, disinterested, and it hurt. He never gave much away, and our conversations felt strained, like he was doing me a favor by answering. Still, I was determined to make it work. I believed in the idea of family, even if it had to be built slowly. Ben and I spent a lot of time talking about Ethan and his struggles. Ben was patient, understanding, and did his best to get Ethan to open up, but I could see the tension. I could see the unspoken worries that hung between them, the unaddressed grief that they hadn't fully processed. But there was something else, too. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Ethan wasn't just quiet or distant. There was something about the way he seemed to avoid me, a subtle discomfort in his presence that I couldn't ignore. It was as though every time I walked into a room, he'd shift uncomfortably or retreat to his space. At first, I thought it was just me being too sensitive, but the more time I spent in the house, the more I began to wonder if I was imagining it. I kept telling myself that time would make things better, that eventually, Ethan would warm up to me, would see me as more than just Ben's new wife. But deep down, I was beginning to wonder if things would ever change. Was I being too patient? Was I waiting for something that might never come? I didn't know the answers, but I was determined to try. I didn't want to give up on this family before it even had a chance to truly start. I wasn't giving up on Ben, on us. And I certainly wasn't going to give up on Ethan, no matter how hard it got. After months of keeping a distance, something shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but I began to notice small changes in Ethan. One evening, I was working on an article at the kitchen table when he wandered in, holding his camera. He seemed hesitant, but instead of retreating to his room like he usually did, he walked over and casually set the camera down in front of me. "Hey, Emma," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I was wondering if you could take a look at some of my photos. I know you write about art sometimes, and I thought you might have some advice." I was caught off guard, not expecting him to seek my opinion, but I was eager to encourage any kind of communication. "Sure, I'd love to," I replied, setting my work aside. As he showed me the photos, mostly landscapes and shots of the city, I could see the passion in his eyes, the attention to detail that he had for his craft. There was something about his work that I hadn't fully recognized before. It wasn't just the technical skill, but there was a kind of rawness in his photos that revealed a side of him I hadn't seen. I offered my thoughts, trying to be both constructive and encouraging. He listened intently, nodding at times, asking questions when he was curious about my perspective. It wasn't much, just a brief exchange over his photography, but it felt like a breakthrough. For the first time in a long while, Ethan wasn't shutting me out. He was letting me in, if only a little bit. In the days that followed, he continued to seek me out, sometimes showing me new photos he'd taken, or asking me what I thought about something he had read in a magazine. It was always small, seemingly innocent gestures, but I noticed the change. Ethan wasn't avoiding me anymore. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it felt significant. One afternoon while I was sitting in the living room, I noticed Ethan flipping through an old photo album of mine, the kind that I'd left out when I was cleaning up. Without thinking, I asked him if he was interested in photography, or if he'd ever considered writing about his photos. To my surprise, he responded with a slight smile. "I don't know if I'm good enough for that," he said, his voice more relaxed than I had ever heard it. "But I've been thinking about it. I guess I'm just not sure where to start." This time, I leaned into the conversation. "You're already doing it, Ethan. Your photos tell stories on their own. Sometimes it's not about being perfect. It's about expressing what you see and feel." He seemed to appreciate that, offering a brief nod. The conversation was brief, but there was an intimacy in that moment, a kind of trust that I hadn't realized had begun to develop between us. From then on, the walls Ethan had built around himself began to seem less impenetrable. He would stop by my workspace more often, asking for my thoughts on everything from photography to music to his college life. It wasn't a deep connection, not yet anyway, but I could sense that he was starting to let down his guard, if only slightly. It was a relief, in many ways. I hadn't expected to bond so quickly, especially with everything that had happened in the past months. I'd been patient, waiting for him to come around, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He was beginning to trust me, and while I wasn't ready to assume it meant everything was fixed, I couldn't ignore the small progress we were making. Still, there was a lingering thought in the back of my mind, something that told me that, for all the surface-level changes, there might be more going on with Ethan than I fully understood. I had to stay cautious, aware of the delicate balance I was trying to strike between being supportive and not overstepping. But for the first time, I felt like we were starting to build something real, and that felt like a step in the right direction. Despite the small signs of progress, the tension between Ethan and me didn't disappear overnight. If anything, it became more palpable. There were days when we would have a brief conversation, and I'd feel hopeful, only for him to retreat into silence the next moment. It was as though his openness was always on a tightrope, ready to snap at any moment. For every step forward, we seemed to take 2 steps back. One evening, Ben and I were sitting in the living room, chatting about his day, when Ethan walked in, looking as though something was weighing heavily on him. He didn't say a word as he walked past us, his expression unreadable. I could feel the shift in the air, a heaviness that seemed to settle over the room. Ben, ever the patient father, attempted to engage him. "Hey, Ethan, is everything okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He stood by the door, looking out the window for a long moment. I could tell something was eating at him, something deeper than what he was willing to share. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. "I just don't know what I'm supposed to do, okay?" he said, his frustration barely concealed. "Everything's a mess. I'm still trying to figure things out and nothing's making sense anymore. I don't even know why I bother sometimes." There was a rawness in his voice, a vulnerability I hadn't heard before. Ben and I exchanged a glance, both of us uncertain how to handle this new side of Ethan. I knew Ben wanted to step in and offer comfort, but I could see he was giving Ethan the space to work through this on his own. I sat there, frozen, unsure of how to respond. I had been trying to tiptoe around Ethan's emotions, afraid of saying the wrong thing. But now, in this moment, I realized that perhaps it was time to stop waiting and start being more direct. I wasn't going to push him, but I could be honest. "Ethan," I said carefully, my voice steady. "I know it's not easy, but you don't have to do it alone. I'm here for you, whether you want to talk or just need someone to listen." He looked at me, eyes narrowing. There was something in his expression, almost a challenge, like he was measuring me, trying to decide if I was just another person who wouldn't stick around. Or worse, someone who didn't truly understand. "Yeah?" he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "You really think you get it?" I took a deep breath, holding his gaze. "No, I don't pretend to get it. I can't know what you're going through, Ethan. But I do know that pushing people away doesn't make it better. I'm not going anywhere, so if you ever want to talk, or if you just need space, I'm here." It wasn't much, but it was the most honest thing I had said to him in weeks. And for a moment, it felt like he was considering my words. Instead of the usual retreat into silence, Ethan stood there for a while, his gaze drifting to the floor. Finally, he nodded. Though it wasn't a sign of agreement, it was just a silent acknowledgement of the truth in my words. Then, without another word, he left the room, retreating to his corner of the house. The air seemed to hang heavy in his absence. I turned to Ben, who was watching me carefully. "I think I may have just made things worse," I said, frustration bubbling up. Ben shook his head. "Number you spoke from the heart. Sometimes that's all you can do. We're not going to fix everything overnight, Emma." I knew he was right, but the weight of the conversation still lingered. Ethan wasn't ready to fully open up, and I couldn't force him. But something in me told me this was a turning point, a moment where the surface-level pleasantries were no longer enough. I wasn't sure what the future held for us, or if Ethan would ever fully accept me as a part of his life, but I was willing to fight for it. I had already committed to Ben, and in doing so, I had committed to Ethan as well, whether he realized it or not. The tension between us wasn't going to disappear overnight. It was going to take time, effort, and maybe a little bit of patience I hadn't expected to need. But I wasn't giving up, not on Ben and not on Ethan, not yet. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the whole house seemed to slow down. Ben had gone out to meet some friends for a late dinner, leaving Ethan and me alone at home. I had just finished up a long day of writing, my mind swirling with deadlines and the weight of recent events. I settled onto the couch, a warm cup of tea in hand, hoping for a few moments of peace before the chaos of tomorrow hit. That's when Ethan came in. I was surprised to see him still up, considering it was getting late. He hesitated at the doorway, a quiet uncertainty in his posture. He seemed almost out of place, like he wasn't sure if he should be there or not. The tension between us, while subtle, was still palpable. Yet tonight it felt different. The air in the room was thick with something unspoken, a change in the dynamic that I couldn't quite place. "Emma?" he said, his voice sounding far softer than usual. He cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "Can I talk to you about something?" I sat up straight, the instinct to protect myself rising. A conversation with Ethan, given our past interactions, could go in any direction. But I nodded, putting my tea aside, giving him the space to speak. "Of course," I said gently, trying to keep my tone neutral. "What's on your mind?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over and sat down at the far end of the couch, his body stiff, as if he was preparing for something big. I could tell he was struggling. Each word he spoke weighed down with hesitations. He started, but paused. He looked at his hands for a moment, taking a breath before looking up at me. I've been thinking about something for a while now, and I don't know how to say it. I could feel my pulse quicken. My mind raced, trying to predict where this was heading, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. I think I have feelings for you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes were wide, searching mine for any sign of rejection or disbelief. I know it sounds crazy, but it's just been building up, and I don't know what to do with it anymore. I don't even know why or how it happened, but I can't ignore it. I froze. The world around me seemed to stop. His words hung in the air, a heavy weight that I couldn't escape from. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I had heard him correctly. The room felt suffocating, and I suddenly became acutely aware of the beating of my heart. I tried to keep my composure, but inside everything felt like it was crumbling. My mind raced to process his confession. How did we get here? How had this delicate, uncomfortable moment become the reality I had to confront? I could feel my chest tighten, panic rising. My throat went dry as I searched for the right words, but nothing came. I had to respond, had to say something, but what could I say to make this situation better? Finally, I found my voice, the words coming out shaky but firm. Ethan, I don't know what to say. This is complicated. I swallowed hard. You're like a son to me, and what you're feeling right now, it's not something we can just ignore, but it's also not something that I can encourage. I saw the pain flash in his eyes, the hurt that immediately followed my words. His face fell, his body slumping as if the weight of my rejection had hit him hard. I could feel the tension in the room shift, the air thickening with something heavy and unspoken between us. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable, he muttered, his voice low. I didn't ask for this. It just happened, and I've been trying to figure it out on my own, but it's been eating at me. I nodded slowly, trying to steady my own emotions. I know this is difficult, but you need to understand that feelings like this can't just go unchecked, Ethan. It's important that we don't let this complicate our relationship. I care about you, but it has to be in the way that a stepmother cares about her stepson. His eyes were filled with confusion, hurt, and maybe even a bit of anger. He didn't respond right away, and for a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of us. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never meant for this to happen. I could see that his internal struggle wasn't over, and I knew this wasn't going to be something we could just brush off. His words, raw and painful as they were, had shifted something in me as well. I couldn't ignore what he had said, but I also knew I had to stand firm in protecting the boundaries between us. I know, I said softly, but we're going to figure this out. We have to. With that, Ethan stood up and walked out of the room without another word. The door clicked shut softly behind him, leaving me in a silence that felt deafening. My hands trembled slightly, and I took a deep breath to steady myself. I knew this was only the beginning of what would be a difficult and uncomfortable journey. I wasn't sure where things would go from here, but I knew that I couldn't pretend that this moment wasn't significant. It wasn't just about Ethan's feelings. It was about everything that had been left unsaid between us, everything that was still hanging in the balance. And now, more than ever, I had to hold my ground. For both our sakes. In the days that followed Ethan's confession, something inside me began to shift. It wasn't just the weight of his words that was difficult to carry. It was the way his presence started to feel different, more invasive, as if his emotions had not only unsettled him, but had also begun to seep into the very fabric of our home. I had hoped, naively perhaps, that we could just go back to some semblance of normal, that we could brush it all under the rug and move on. But every time Ethan walked into a room, every time he lingered just a little too long, I felt it. That uncomfortable tension. It wasn't just the lingering glances or the slight touches that he had started to let slip when he passed by. It was the way he seemed to be everywhere I was, standing just a little too close while I was cooking, sitting a little too near when I was working on my laptop, offering to help with things around the house even though he knew I didn't need it. Every time I turned around, there he was, as though he was waiting for me to invite him into my space, my life, my world. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was testing the boundaries, testing me. It wasn't like he was doing anything overtly inappropriate. It wasn't like he was saying anything more than he had before. But his actions, his behavior, had taken on a subtle, unnerving quality. I started to notice things that I hadn't before. How he always tried to position himself where I was sitting, how he would pause a little too long when I spoke to him, how he'd make sure to catch my eye just as I was about to look away. Little things, insignificant on their own but taken together, they painted a clear picture, one that made me uneasy. And yet, I didn't want to acknowledge it. I didn't want to believe that Ethan, someone I had been trying so hard to build a relationship with, could be trying to cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. I tried to tell myself it was just his way of coping with the rejection, just a phase he would eventually get over. But no matter how many times I tried to convince myself, that gnawing feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. There were nights I would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every interaction, trying to figure out if I had missed something. Had I said something that encouraged him? Had I somehow led him on without realizing it? I replayed our moments together in my mind, searching for any signs that I had failed him in some way, any indication that I had misunderstood the situation, but I couldn't find an answer. All I knew was that the more I tried to brush it off, the more obvious it became that Ethan's feelings weren't going to disappear on their own. And with every passing day, the weight of the situation only grew heavier. There was an incident one afternoon that really made it hit home. I was sitting on the back porch, working on a new piece for a magazine, when Ethan came out and sat beside me. At first, I didn't think much of it. He often came outside to spend time in the quiet of the yard, just like I did. But then he moved closer. A little too close. Close enough that I could feel the heat of his body next to mine. Close enough that I couldn't ignore the feeling of his presence. At that moment, I felt trapped. I couldn't just ask him to leave, not without making it painfully awkward. But I also couldn't ignore the knot that had formed in my stomach. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and kept my focus on the screen in front of me. But I knew deep down that I couldn't keep brushing aside the growing discomfort. The whole situation felt like walking a tightrope, and I was afraid of falling. What would happen if I confronted him again? Would that make it worse? Would I drive him further away from Ben and me? What if, in trying to protect myself, I ended up making everything harder than it needed to be? I was starting to feel the weight of carrying this secret alone. Ben had no idea about any of it, not the lingering discomfort, not the subtle signs I had started to see in Ethan's behavior. I couldn't bring myself to tell him, not yet, not until I understood what was really going on. But the more Ethan seemed to test those boundaries, the more I realized I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. And the fear of what might happen next, of what Ethan might do or say, was becoming overwhelming. The calm facade I had carefully built around myself was starting to crack, and I knew I couldn't hold it together for much longer. I needed to figure out a way to stop this before it went any further. But how? And more importantly, could I protect Ben from the truth without destroying everything we had worked so hard to build? The tension was unbearable, and I knew that sooner or later I would have to face the reality of the situation, whether I was ready to or not. It happened a few days after the incident on the porch. Ethan found me alone in the living room one afternoon, his usual quiet demeanor replaced by something I hadn't seen before. Nervousness, maybe even shame. He stood by the doorway for a moment, as if weighing the right words to say, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost hesitant. "Emma, I need to apologize," he said, his eyes avoiding mine. "I don't know what came over me. I never meant to make you feel uncomfortable, I swear. I don't know why I felt that way." I didn't know how to respond. His words weren't exactly an admission of guilt, but there was a vulnerability in his tone that made me pause. I couldn't decide if he was being genuine or if he was simply trying to ease his own conscience. Either way, the apology felt like both a relief and a new complication. "I appreciate your apology, Ethan," I said, keeping my voice steady. But I need you to understand that what happened wasn't okay. We're family, and those kinds of feelings, it's not something you should have to deal with, but it's something you need to work through. For all our sakes. He nodded, but his expression remained troubled. I never wanted to make you feel trapped. I swear I didn't think it through. I just kept, I don't know, hoping things could be different. That you could... He stopped himself, running a hand through his hair in frustration, as if the words themselves were too painful to finish. I watched him, searching his face for some sign that he truly understood the gravity of what he was saying, that he was truly grappling with his emotions. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same confusion that had been there from the moment he'd confessed his feelings. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about him realizing that his emotions weren't just a passing phase, but something deeper, something he had to come to terms with. Ethan, I said gently, my voice softening a little. This is complicated. It's not just about me or you. It's about what's best for this family. You need to figure out where these feelings are coming from. I don't know what you're going through, but you need to find a way to deal with it. Outside of our home. Outside of this relationship we're trying to build. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe? Or a kind of quiet desperation. I just don't know what to do with all of this, Emma. I don't know how to stop feeling how I feel. It's messing everything up. His words struck me more than I expected. I wanted to feel sorry for him, wanted to empathize with how difficult it must be for him to face his emotions head on. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the fact that his feelings had put me in an incredibly uncomfortable position. I wasn't sure if I could ever look at him the same way again. Not in the way that had once made me feel like we were slowly but surely forming a relationship as stepmother and stepson. Now it felt like something more complicated, more fragile. I sighed, rubbing my temples. Look, I know it's not easy. I know you didn't mean to make things harder. But you need to take a step back, Ethan. We both do. I can't handle this tension anymore. He was silent for a moment, and I could see the wheels turning in his head, processing everything I had said. I wasn't sure if he understood, or if he was just trying to appease me with a half-hearted apology. It wasn't enough for me to let my guard down. Not yet. I had to stay strong no matter how difficult this conversation was, no matter how much I wanted things to go back to normal. I'll try, he finally said, his voice quiet but sincere. I really will. I don't want to make things harder for you or Ben. I nodded, feeling a slight sense of relief wash over me. It wasn't the answer I had hoped for, but it was something. A small step forward, at least. But deep down, I knew that this wasn't over, that the emotional strain of what had happened would linger for much longer than I had expected. As Ethan left the room, I sat there for a moment, staring at the empty space where he had been standing. My chest tightened as the weight of everything settled back into place. His apology had been genuine, but it wasn't enough to erase the discomfort, the uncertainty that had taken root in my mind. And while I hoped that Ethan would find a way to sort through his emotions, I couldn't shake the feeling that the damage had already been done. I had no idea how things would progress from here, but one thing was clear. This family would never be the same. The days that followed Ethan's apology seemed to pass by in a blur. On the surface, everything appeared to be calm. Ethan made a conscious effort to give me space, and I tried my best to carry on with our daily routines as if nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, the tension was still there, lingering in every glance, every word spoken with too much care. Ben, as usual, was focused on his work, his business, and the responsibilities he had around the house. He was oblivious to the subtle changes I had noticed in Ethan's behavior, and I was careful not to let on. But despite my efforts to keep everything normal, I could sense that Ben's intuition was starting to pick up on something. He wasn't blind. He was just more patient, more trusting than I had been. It happened one evening after dinner. We were sitting on the couch in the living room, watching TV when Ben casually turned to me. He didn't seem anxious or upset, just calm, as if he had been mulling something over for a while. His voice was low but steady as he spoke. Emma, is everything okay with you and Ethan? The question caught me off guard, and I froze for a moment. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to respond without revealing too much. I couldn't bring myself to outright lie to him, but I also didn't want to burden him with the complexity of what had been happening. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my heart was pounding in my chest. Ben gave me a thoughtful look, his eyes searching mine for any hint of hesitation. "I don't know, you just seem different lately. There's something going on, and I can tell it's not just about the usual stuff. Has something happened between you and Ethan?" His words were so calm, yet there was an underlying knowing in them. Ben had always been intuitive. He could read me like an open book when something was wrong. It was both a blessing and a curse. I could never hide anything from him for long, even when I desperately wanted to. I swallowed hard, unsure of how to proceed. Should I tell him the truth? Or should I try to brush it off, hoping that the situation would resolve itself on its own? I glanced over at him, his face filled with concern, and I knew that I couldn't lie. "Ben," I began, my voice faltering slightly. There's something I need to tell you. It's about Ethan." His expression softened, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a slight tightening of his jaw, a hint of concern that hadn't been there before. He listened intently as I explained everything, from Ethan's confession to the discomfort I had been feeling in the weeks that followed. I told him about the apology, about the lingering tension, and about how it was all starting to affect me. Ben's face remained expressionless as I spoke, his gaze unwavering. But I could see the thoughts running through his mind, the wheels turning as he processed the information I had just given him. When I finished, there was a long silence between us, and I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, Ben spoke, his voice steady but firm. "I had a feeling something wasn't right. I don't know what it is about him, Emma, but I've been sensing it for a while now. Ethan's always been distant, but this is different." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I hadn't realized how much I had been carrying this secret alone until that moment, when Ben's words validated everything I had been struggling with. The relief was palpable, but it was also mixed with a sense of dread. The truth was out now, and things were never going to be the same. "I don't know what to do, Ben," I admitted, my voice breaking a little. "I don't know how to make things right. I don't know how to make Ethan stop. I'm scared of what might happen next." Ben reached over and took my hand in his, squeezing it gently. "We'll figure it out together. I don't want you feeling like this, Emma. I don't want Ethan to make you feel uncomfortable in your own home. We'll set boundaries. And if we need to talk to him again, we will. But we're in this together. Don't ever forget that." His words, so simple and direct, brought a strange sense of comfort. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to carry this burden alone. I had Ben by my side, and together, we could face whatever came next. But as much as I appreciated Ben's reassurance, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that things were far from resolved. Ethan's feelings hadn't just disappeared, and despite my best efforts to keep everything under control, the sense that something more sinister was lurking beneath the surface remained. I just hoped that I was wrong. I hoped that Ethan could find a way to move on, to put his emotions in check, and that we could all go back to being a family again. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't ignore the fear that things were about to get more complicated than I ever could have anticipated. As the night wore on, I leaned into Ben's embrace, letting the weight of the conversation sink in. But I knew that this was just the beginning. There were more difficult decisions ahead, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for them. The tension between Ethan and me lingered, despite his apology. Ben, ever perceptive, noticed the strain and finally asked one evening, "Emma, is everything okay with you and Ethan?" I hesitated, but eventually confessed to Ben about Ethan's behavior, the apology, and how things felt off between us. Ben's face grew serious as he listened. "I've been feeling it too," he said. "I don't trust Ethan. There's something not right. We need to set boundaries with him." I nodded, relieved to not have to hide my discomfort anymore, but worried about what would come next. Ben was resolute. He'd confront Ethan. "If he can't respect you, we'll have to make hard choices," he added firmly. The weight of the situation was heavy, but I knew Ben was right. The decision was inevitable. The next step was clear: confront Ethan and make things right, even if it meant changing everything between us.